The billionaire fires his maid for stealing food, but when he follows her home, what he discovers makes him break down in tears. Hello friends. Welcome to our story. Before we start, please like this video and subscribe. Also, tell us in the comments, where are you watching from? New York? London? Maybe South Africa or Jamaica? We want to know. It had been an ordinary Wednesday at the Anderson mansion. The kind of day that starts quiet and gray, where the sky can't quite decide if it wants to be morning yet. The birds were still thinking about it. The streets were still half asleep. But Maria was already moving. She was 24 years old. Small and thin, with a face that was pretty in a serious kind of way, the kind of pretty you don't notice right away because she never gave you time to look. She was always moving. Always busy. Always with her head down and her hands doing something. She had worked at the Anderson mansion for 3 years, and in those 3 years she had learned one very important lesson about rich houses. The best maid is the one nobody sees. So she made herself invisible. Every single day. She came in through the back door. She changed her shoes at the staff entrance. She tied her apron without being asked. And she began to clean, quietly, carefully, room by room, while the rest of the house was still sleeping. But that morning had been harder than most. She had woken at 5 o'clock, long before the alarm she never actually needed. She lay still in the darkness of her small room and listened. And then she heard it, the sound that always made her chest go tight. The cough. It came from the next room. Deep and rough and terrible. Not like a normal cough at all. Nothing like the kind you get from a cold or a tickle in the throat. This cough sounded like it came from the very bottom of the lungs. Like something was tearing. It went on in the darkness, and Maria lay there holding her own breath, waiting until finally it stopped. Silence. Then the sound of her grandmother settling back against the pillow. Maria got up. She pushed open the bedroom door and stood in the dim gray light and looked at Doris. Her grandmother was asleep again now, thank God. Her silver hair spread soft around her head, her chest rising and falling in slow, uneven breaths. Her face looked pale. Paler than yesterday, Maria thought. Or maybe she was imagining it. She had been watching so carefully for so long that sometimes she didn't know anymore what was real and what was just fear wearing the face of something real. Doris was 71 years old. She was small and curved slightly forward at the shoulders now, the way tall trees bend when the wind has blown against them for many years. But her eyes, when they were open, were sharp and warm and full of a light that the illness had not managed to put out. Not yet. She was the only family Maria had in the world. When Maria was 3 years old, her parents had been killed in a road accident. A collision on a dark highway late at night. Maria had no memory of them, not really. What she had was Doris. Doris' arms pulling her close. Doris' voice singing in the kitchen. Doris' hands always warm, always reaching for her. Her grandmother had raised her alone, taking every kind of work she could find, washing other people's clothes, selling at the market, cleaning offices through the night, anything, everything, whatever it took to keep them together and alive. And now Doris was the one who was sick. Lung cancer. The doctors had said those 2 words 6 months ago, in a small office that smelled of antiseptic and old paper. Maria had sat very still in the plastic chair and listened while the doctor explained everything. The treatment, the medication, the costs. She had nodded. She had said yes and thank you. And then she had walked outside to the car park, stood against the wall of the hospital building, and let herself cry for exactly 3 minutes. 3 minutes. That was all she allowed. Then she wiped her face and went back inside and asked for the bill. That was Maria. That was simply who she was. She left home without eating breakfast. There was a little rice in the kitchen, but that was saved for her grandmother's afternoon meal and she would not touch it. She picked up her worn canvas bag, looked once more at Doris sleeping, and walked out into the early morning. The dirt road outside stretched ahead of her in the pale light, dusty and uneven, the kind of road that the city had simply forgotten about. She walked almost 2 kilometers to the bus stop, her shoes raising small clouds of dust with every step. Other people were already moving. Women with basins on their heads, men on bicycles, children in uniforms dragging their school bags behind them. Maria walked among them with her eyes forward and her mind on the list she carried in her head. The pill bottle on the kitchen shelf. The one she had shaken that morning and counted by sound, 4 days left. Maybe 5 if Doris skipped the evening dose, which she would never agree to. And the next bottle would cost $38 she did not currently have, because the bus fares this week had been higher than expected, and the landlord had sent a message about rent that she hadn't replied to yet, and next Thursday was the hospital appointment and she still hadn't worked out how to pay for that either. She did the numbers in her head the way she always did, quickly, quietly, like pressing on a bruise just to check if it still hurt. It still hurt. The bus was crowded. She stood the whole way, one hand on the overhead rail, swaying with the movement, pressed between other tired people going to other difficult places. She watched the city change outside the window, the narrow roads of her neighborhood giving way to wider streets giving way to big smooth roads lined with trees that were actually trimmed, and then the tall clean buildings of the wealthy part of the city, where the houses sat behind high walls and the gardens were green all year because someone watered them every morning whether it rained or not. She arrived at the mansion at 6:15, signed in, changed her shoes, tied her apron, and began. By 9 o'clock she had already cleaned 4 rooms and mopped 2 hallways. She moved through the house the way she always did, quickly, carefully, without a sound, touching things just enough to fix them and moving on. The tall rooms of the Anderson mansion swallowed her up and gave nothing back. She was a shadow with a mop. A pair of quiet hands behind a closed door. She went to the kitchen to get a glass of water. Janet, the mansion's chef, a wide, warm woman in her 50s with a voice like a church bell, had not yet arrived. The kitchen was empty. So, cool. It smelled of last night's dinner and the citrus cleaning product someone had used on the floors early that morning. And on the counter near the back wall, the counter where Janet always set aside whatever was left over, whatever would not be used again, Maria saw the bread. 2 dinner rolls from the evening before. Golden brown. Barely touched. Beside them, 3 pieces of fruit, a peach, 2 plums, that had gone just a little too soft to be put on Mr. Anderson's table. They would be in the bin by lunchtime. That was simply how things worked in a house like this. Anything less than perfect got thrown away. It had nothing to do with hunger or waste or whether someone somewhere might need it. It was just the rule of the place. Maria stood and looked at the bread. Her stomach made a small, embarrassing sound. She pressed her hand flat against it without thinking. And then she thought about the pill bottle. 4 days. Maybe 5. $38 she did not have. She thought about Doris' face in the gray morning light, pale against the pillow. She thought about that cough, deep and tearing, filling the dark house. She thought about the landlord's message. The hospital appointment. The numbers she had added and added and added until they stopped adding up. She looked to her left. To her right. The kitchen was empty. The other staff were upstairs. Maria closed her eyes for 1 second. Just one. It might have been a prayer. It might have been an apology. She was not entirely sure which. Maybe it was both at the same time. Then she opened her eyes. And she reached out and put the bread rolls and the fruit into her bag. Maria. She turned around so fast she nearly knocked the bag off the counter. Richard Anderson was standing in the kitchen doorway. He was 38 years old and tall and broad-shouldered, the kind of man who took up space in a room without trying. He was already dressed, gray suit, white shirt, silver watch, even at this hour of the morning. He had a coffee cup in one hand. And his eyes were fixed on her with a look that was not yet angry, but was something much colder than anger. Certainty. The look of a man who has just seen exactly what he thought he was going to see. Maria could not speak. Her mouth opened. Nothing came out. Because there was nothing to say. The bag was right there, open on the counter between them, and the bread rolls and the fruit were sitting inside it where anyone in the world could see. Richard put his coffee cup down on the marble counter. He did it slowly, carefully, without making a sound, without taking his eyes off her. He looked at the bag. He looked at her. Put it back. Her hands were shaking so badly that she nearly dropped the bread when she took it out. She placed the rolls back on the counter. Then the fruit. 1 piece at a time. Her fingers trembling. Her eyes filling up, but she did not cry. She had made herself a promise about that a long time ago. Not in front of him. Never in front of him. You can leave, Richard said. His voice was perfectly calm. It did not need to rise. Today is your last day. I don't keep thieves in my house. Those words landed inside her chest like stones dropped into still water. She picked up her bag, her empty bag, her stupid, empty bag. She lowered her head. She walked to the back door, the same back door she had walked through every single morning for 3 years, the door she could find in the dark, the door whose handle she had gripped so many times that her palm knew the shape of it, and she walked out. For the very last time. The door clicked shut behind her. And the mansion went on exactly as it always had, quiet, clean, and perfectly in order, as if she had never been there at all. Richard Anderson did not think about Maria after she left. Or at least that was what he told himself. He finished his coffee. He went to his office on the 2nd floor, a large, well-ordered room with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves and a desk the size of a small boat, and he opened his laptop and he worked. He had 3 calls before noon. A meeting with his property manager at 2. A contract to review before 5. Richard Anderson's days were full in the way that important men's days were always full, one thing pressing against the next, no gaps, no empty spaces, no room for anything that wasn't already on the schedule. He worked. He did not think about Maria. He did not think about the way her hands had been shaking, or the way she had placed the bread back on the counter, slowly, carefully, like she was handling something fragile, or the way she had walked to the door with her head down, not arguing, not explaining, not even asking him to reconsider. He did not think about any of that. He was on his second call, something about a commercial property in the north of the city, when he noticed that he had been turning his coffee cup in a slow circle on the desk without realizing it. Round and round. He stopped. He put his hand flat on the desk. He focused on the voice coming through the phone and he answered whatever question had been asked and the call continued. But the cup had moved again by the time he hung up. Janet arrived at the mansion at 11 o'clock to begin preparations for lunch. She came in through the back door, the same back door, and immediately felt that something was different. She couldn't have said exactly what it was. The kitchen was clean and quiet and exactly as it should be, except that the bread rolls and the fruit she had set aside from last night were back on the counter instead of in the bin where she expected them to be. She stood and looked at them. Then she went to find the other house staff. It took her less than 5 minutes to learn what had happened. Sam, the kitchen helper, told her. He had heard it from Clara, who cleaned the upstairs rooms, who had heard it from the front gate guard, who had seen Maria leaving on foot at 9:15 in the morning with her bag and her coat and the particular, terrible stillness of someone who is holding themselves together by force. Janet stood in the corridor outside the kitchen and listened to Sam tell the story. And as she listened, her face did something that it didn't do very often. It went very, very still. He fired her, she said. That's what Clara said. For the bread. And the fruit. Janet was quiet for a moment. She looked at the floor. Her jaw moved slightly, like she was chewing on something that tasted bad. Where is Mr. Anderson now? His office, I think. Thank you, Sam. She went back to the kitchen. She stood at the counter for a long moment, her hands resting on the surface, looking at the bread rolls that Maria had placed back with such care. She picked one up and turned it over in her fingers. It was already going stale. By tomorrow it would be hard and dry and useless. She put it down. Then she untied her apron, folded it over the back of a chair, and walked down the hall to the staircase. She knocked on the office door twice and opened it without waiting for an answer. That was one of the privileges of having worked in the same house for 11 years. You earned the right to knock and enter. Richard was at his desk, reading something on his screen. He looked up. Janet. Sir. She came in and closed the door behind her. She did not sit down. Janet rarely sat down when she had something to say. She said it better on her feet. I heard about Maria. Something moved across his face. Very quickly and then it was gone. It's been handled. I know it's been handled. I want to talk about how it was handled. Richard leaned back slightly in his chair. He looked at her the way he looked at people who were about to say something he didn't want to hear. Not hostile exactly, but prepared. Armored. She was caught stealing, Janet. It's not complicated. She took leftover bread and fruit that were going in the bin. What she took is not the point. The point is that she took it without permission. In this house, that is stealing and the rules. Mr. Anderson. Janet's voice was not loud, but it had a quality that made you stop talking. 11 years in this house and she had used that voice maybe 4 times. He stopped. Do you know why she took it? He said nothing. Do you know anything about Maria at all? About her life outside this house? He looked at her steadily. That's not something Her grandmother is dying. The office went quiet. Outside the window, the gardener was running the sprinklers. The sound of water hitting leaves came through faintly, soft and rhythmic, very far away. Lung cancer, Janet said. She was diagnosed 6 months ago. Maria pays for all of it, the treatment, the medication, everything, on the salary she earns here. Which, as you know, is not a large salary. She paused. She never eats at work. Did you know that? In 3 years, I have never once seen that girl eat a single thing in this kitchen. Not a biscuit. Not a piece of fruit. Nothing. Because she decided the food here wasn't hers to take. Richard had not moved. He was looking at a point just past Janet's shoulder, or maybe at nothing at all. The food you caught her with was going in the bin, Janet continued. It was already going in the bin. I had set it aside to be thrown away. And she stood in that kitchen, probably after a morning of cleaning 4 rooms on an empty stomach, and she saw that bread and she thought about her sick grandmother at home and she made a desperate choice. She let that sit in the air between them. You never asked about her, Janet said quietly. You never asked about any of us. What our lives are like. What we carry when we walk through that back door every morning. She stopped herself. Took a breath. When she spoke again, her voice was gentler. I'm not saying you're a bad man, sir. I'm saying you made a quick decision about a situation you didn't fully understand. Richard was still looking at that point past her shoulder. Is that everything? He said. His voice was careful. Controlled. The voice of a man keeping a lid on something. Janet picked up her folded apron from under her arm. That's everything, she said. She walked to the door. Then she stopped and looked back at him. She never once complained. In 3 years. Never asked for anything. Never late except when the bus was slow, which isn't something she can control. She paused. She was a good worker, Mr. Anderson. Better than good. She left. She pulled the door closed behind her, quietly, which somehow felt louder than a slam. Richard sat at his desk for a long time after that. The screen in front of him had gone dark from inactivity. He didn't wake it. He sat with his hands flat on the desk and looked at his own reflection in the black glass, vague and dark, barely a shape, and thought about what Janet had said. Her grandmother is dying. She never eats at work. You never asked. He turned his coffee cup in a slow circle again. He caught himself and stopped. He thought about the moment in the kitchen. He replayed it the way he had been replaying it all morning, pretending he wasn't. He saw her face when she turned around. And the thing that he had labeled in his own mind as the look of someone caught, the flush, the shaking hands, the open mouth with no words, he looked at it again now more slowly and he saw something else. It wasn't guilt. He had seen guilt. He had fired people for genuine theft before. A driver who had been skimming money from the fuel account for 8 months, a manager who had falsified receipts. He knew what guilt looked like. It argued. It deflected. It tried to make itself smaller but kept looking for a way out. Maria had not looked for a way out. She had simply put the bread back on the counter, piece by piece, with shaking hands, and then she had walked to the door. Like someone who already knew there was no point. He pushed back his chair and stood up. He went to the window and looked out at the garden. The trimmed hedges, the stone path, the fountain running in its patient circle. All of it perfect. All of it exactly as it should be. You never asked about any of us. He stood at the window for a long time. Then he went back to his desk and pressed a button on his phone. Clara, he said when she answered. Do we have an address for Maria on file? A short pause. Yes, sir, it should be in the staff records. Send it to my phone, please. Another pause. Shorter this time. Of course, sir. He ended the call. He looked at his schedule. The property manager meeting at 2. The contract review at 5. A full afternoon exactly as planned. He looked at it for a moment. Then he picked up his jacket from the back of his chair. He was going to drive. He didn't know exactly why. He wasn't the kind of man who did things without knowing exactly why. He was, in almost every way, a man who acted on logic and structure and clear reason. But something Janet had said was sitting in the middle of his chest like a stone, and no amount of reasoning was moving it. She was a good worker, Mr. Anderson. Better than good. He needed to see something. He didn't know what, but he needed to see it. He took his keys and went downstairs. Richard Anderson had driven through most parts of this city at one point or another. He had driven to board meetings in glass towers downtown. He had driven to dinner at restaurants where the menu had no prices because the kind of people who ate there didn't need to see prices. He had driven to the airport, to the golf club, to the homes of other wealthy men in other wealthy neighborhoods where the walls were high and the gates were heavy and the world outside felt very distant and very manageable. He had not driven to this part of the city before. He noticed the change gradually, the way you notice weather shifting, not all at once but in small degrees that add up to something completely different. The roads narrowed. The smooth tarmac gave way to patched concrete, and then the patched concrete gave way to something that was somewhere between road and dirt track, marked more by habit than by any official decision. The buildings pressed closer together. The spaces between them filled up with life. A woman frying things in a blackened pan over a small fire, children kicking a flattened plastic bottle between them, a man asleep in a plastic chair outside a tiny shop with no sign. Richard kept his eyes on the GPS. He drove slowly, partly because the road demanded it and partly because something in him wanted to slow down. To actually look. He had driven through places like this before, passed through them technically on the way to somewhere else, but he had not looked. Not really. The window of a moving car is a very comfortable place from which to not look. Now he looked. He saw the open drains running along the edge of the road, dark water moving slowly through them. He saw the electricity wires looping overhead in great tangled bundles between crooked poles, way too many wires for any kind of plan, just wire after wire added over years and years until the sky above the road was crosshatched with black lines. He saw a group of young boys sharing a single phone, passing it between them, each one watching the screen with complete attention. He saw a woman hanging washing on a line between two houses. The clothes were clean and bright against the gray wall behind them, yellow and red and a vivid green, snapping gently in the small wind. The GPS told him to turn left. He turned left onto a road that was barely wide enough for his car. He drove slowly, very slowly, checking the numbers on the buildings, where there were numbers. Some houses had them. Some had faded paint where the numbers used to be. Some had nothing at all. He found it by process of elimination. A small house near the end of the road. Faded yellow walls, the paint peeling in large curved strips that showed the gray cement underneath. A wooden door painted brown, the color worn almost away near the handle from years of hands touching the same spot. Two small windows with curtains behind them, pale blue curtains, faded but clean, closed against the afternoon heat. Richard parked the car. He sat for a moment without getting out. The street was quiet at this hour. A cat watched him from the top of the low wall next to the house. A radio played somewhere nearby, the sound thin and far away, a voice singing something he couldn't quite make out. The afternoon sun was flat and heavy, pressing down on everything. He looked at the house. He thought about his own house. The fountain. The 14-person dining table. The chandelier with 42 bulbs. He got out of the car. He walked up the short path to the front door, dirt packed hard by many feet over many years, with two smooth stones placed as rough stepping stones that someone had put there with care. He raised his hand to knock. And then he heard voices inside. He stopped. He had not meant to listen. He was not a man who pressed his ear to doors or collected other people's private moments. But the door was thin and the voices were close, and his hand was raised and he had not yet knocked, and before he had made any decision at all, the words were already reaching him. Maria's voice first. Low and careful, the way you speak when you are trying to keep something light that is actually very heavy. I'm going to find something else, Grandma. There are agencies. Mrs. Phillip at the church said her sister's family is looking for someone. Maria. Her grandmother's voice. Older, slower, rougher at the edges from the illness, but with a firmness in it that had not gone anywhere. Tell me the truth. A silence. I lost my job today. Another silence. Longer. The Anderson house? Yes. What happened? Richard stood completely still on the other side of the door. The cat had followed him up the path and was now sitting beside his shoe, looking up at him with no particular opinion. I took some food, Maria said. Food that was going to be thrown away. Bread and some fruit. He caught me. Oh, my love. It was stupid. I know it was stupid. A pause. The kind of pause that has something stuck inside it. I'd counted the pills that morning. There were 4 days left and I didn't have the money for the next bottle and I looked at the bread and she stopped. Come here, Doris said. A soft sound. Movement. Richard could picture it without seeing it. The old woman opening her arms, the young woman folding herself into them, the way people hold each other when words have reached their limit. I sold my phone last week, Maria said, her voice slightly muffled now, as if her face was pressed against her grandmother's shoulder. I didn't tell you because I knew you'd worry. I got $22 for it. That covered the bus for the week and most of the rent message. But it's still not enough. It's not going to be enough. Maria. I'll figure it out. I always figure it out. I just need a few days to think. Her voice steadied itself, gathered itself back together. Don't worry about me. I don't want you worrying about me. You have been telling me not to worry about you since you were 11 years old, Doris said, and there was something in her voice that was almost a laugh, except it wasn't. It was something older and more complicated than a laugh. And every time you say it, I worry twice as much. A small, quiet sound from Maria that might have been almost a laugh too. You are so like your mother, Doris said softly. She never wanted anyone to carry anything for her either. Stubborn, the pair of you. Beautifully, terribly stubborn. Silence. Then Maria's voice, very quiet now. I just didn't want the food to go in the bin. That's all it was. It seemed so wrong. It seemed so. She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. Richard Anderson had been standing on that doorstep for almost 4 minutes. His hand was still raised. He had not knocked. He could not have said exactly when he had stopped being a man about to knock on a door and become a man standing very still in the afternoon sun, listening to something that was rearranging something inside him. I sold my phone last week. I'd counted the pills that morning. It seemed so wrong. He lowered his hand. He stood there for another moment, the cat winding around his ankle now, purring softly. The radio in the nearby house had changed to a different song, something with a slow, warm beat that drifted out into the heavy air and settled over the dirt road like smoke. He thought about this morning. The kitchen. The 2 bread rolls and 3 pieces of fruit sitting in Maria's open bag. His own voice, calm and certain. I don't keep thieves in my house. He had been so sure. He was always so sure. It was one of the things people said about him, admiringly, mostly, though sometimes with an edge, that Richard Anderson was never uncertain. That he made decisions quickly and completely and moved on. It was, he had always believed, a strength. A quality that had built the company, bought the house, shaped the life. Standing on a dirt road doorstep in the heavy afternoon sun, he was not sure it was a strength. He thought about what Janet had said. You never asked about her. You never asked about any of us. He had not asked. In 3 years, Maria had arrived at his house before sunrise and left after dark and cleaned every surface and organized every cupboard and made the place run with a quiet, invisible precision that he had simply taken for granted. The way you take for granted that the lights come on when you flick the switch, without ever thinking about the wires behind the wall. He had never asked her name until it appeared on the staff list. He had never asked her anything. His throat felt tight. He pressed his lips together and looked up at the sky, at the web of wires above the road crossing each other in every direction. Then he looked back at the brown wooden door in front of him, the paint worn thin near the handle, the small scuff at the bottom where it had been kicked open 1,000 times when hands were full. He raised his hand again. And this time he knocked. The sound of movement inside. Pause. Then footsteps, slow and careful, approaching the door. The door opened. Doris looked up at him. She was smaller than he had imagined, though he realized he hadn't really imagined her at all until this moment. She was tiny and white-haired and wrapped in a thin housecoat, and she looked at him with eyes that were sharp and brown and not in the least bit impressed by whatever it was he looked like standing there in his gray suit on her doorstep. Yes, she said. Mrs. He stopped. He realized he didn't know her last name. He only knew her first name because Maria had said it on the other side of the door. I'm Richard Anderson. He paused again, which was unusual for him. He was not a man who paused. Maria works for me. Worked for me. I wonder if I might. Richard Anderson. The way she said it was not a question. It was a recognition. A slow, careful recognition, like picking up something to examine it in the light. Yes. She looked at him for a moment. Just looked. The way old people sometimes look at you, not unkindly but completely as if they can see more of you than you've shown them. Then she stepped back from the door and said, Come in. Maria was standing in the middle of the front room when he entered. She had clearly heard his name. She was standing very straight and very still, her hands at her sides, and her face had a quality that he recognized now, that same quality from the kitchen, that pulled-together stillness of a person keeping everything under control by sheer force of will. Her eyes met his, then looked away, then came back. She said nothing. Richard looked around the room. It was small. Very small. The whole space might have fit inside his office upstairs with room to spare. There was a low sofa against one wall, its fabric faded but covered with a clean cloth. A small wooden table. 2 chairs. A shelf with a few books and a framed photograph. A single light bulb overhead. In the corner, a little kitchen space. A 2-burner gas stove, a blue water container, a few pots hanging on nails. Everything in the room was clean. Everything was in its place. And everything was so profoundly, quietly worn that it made his chest do something he was not prepared for. He looked at Maria. She was still standing straight. Still holding herself together. But her eyes were very bright, and he understood that brightness. It was the brightness of someone who has been crying and has stopped and is determined not to start again. Maria, he said. Her jaw tightened. I came because... He stopped. He had planned what to say in the car. He had assembled the words carefully, logically, in the right order. Now, standing in this small room with its faded sofa and its single light bulb and its worn clean floor, all the assembled words fell apart. I came because I was wrong, he said. She looked at him. I made a decision this morning without understanding the situation. I didn't ask questions. I didn't. He stopped again. He looked at his own hands for a moment as if they might help him. They didn't. Janet told me about your grandmother. About the medication. About? He pressed his lips together. I heard you. Just now. Outside the door. I didn't mean to listen. I heard you talking and I... His voice stopped. He had not expected this. He was not this man, the man whose voice stopped. He was the man who spoke clearly and decisively in every room he entered, who was never at a loss, who had long ago learned to keep the distance between what he felt and what he showed wide enough that nothing leaked through. But something was leaking through now. He looked at Doris, sitting in the chair near the window, watching him with those sharp brown eyes. He looked at the medicine bottles on the small table beside her, 3 of them orange plastic, the kind he had seen in hospitals and never thought about, not once in his life. He looked at Maria, still standing straight, still holding on. And Richard Anderson, who had not cried in front of another person since he was 9 years old, who had sat dry-eyed at his own father's funeral because that was what was expected, who had built an empire on the understanding that feelings were a private matter to be dealt with privately, felt something rise up from somewhere deep and old inside him. His eyes filled. He pressed his hand over his mouth. And for the first time in almost 30 years, a tear ran down Richard Anderson's face. Nobody spoke for a moment. The room held the 3 of them in its small, quiet space. Richard with his hand pressed over his mouth, Maria standing very still, Doris watching from her chair with the particular calm of a woman who had seen enough of life to know that some moments needed to be allowed to simply exist without anyone rushing to fill them. Then Doris said gently, "Sit down, young man." Richard lowered his hand. He looked at her. He nodded once and sat on the edge of the low sofa, and put his hands on his knees and breathed. The way you breathe when you are pulling yourself back together from somewhere you didn't expect to go. Maria had not moved. She was looking at him now with an expression he couldn't quite read. Not anger, not pity, not triumph. Something more careful than any of those. Something that was trying to understand what it was seeing. "Can I get you water?" she asked. Her voice was quiet, steady. "No," he said. "Thank you. He cleared his throat. "I'm fine." A small silence. "You don't look fine," Doris said pleasantly. Despite everything, something moved across Maria's face that was almost a smile. She looked away quickly. Richard looked at Doris. In another situation with another person, a comment like that would have landed badly. He was not someone people spoke to that way. But from this small white-haired woman in her faded housecoat, with her sharp eyes and her 3 medicine bottles and her absolute lack of interest in who he was outside this room, it did not land badly at all. It landed like the truth, which is sometimes its own kind of relief. "No," he admitted. "I don't suppose I do." Doris nodded, satisfied. "Good. Uncomfortable is the right thing to feel." She said it without cruelty. Simply like a doctor reading a chart. "It means your conscience is working. Some people's don't." Richard looked at his hands again. "I owe your granddaughter an apology," he said. "A real one. Not just the words." He looked up at Maria. "What I did this morning was unjust. You had worked in my home for 3 years. 3 years. And I dismissed you in under 2 minutes without asking a single question." He paused. "That was not fairness. I told myself it was fairness, but it wasn't. It was just quickness. And quickness without understanding is not fairness. It's just speed." Maria was looking at him carefully. "I would like you to come back to work," he said. "If you'll consider it." The room was quiet for a moment. "You don't have to do that," Maria said. Her voice was careful, measured. "Because you feel bad." "I know I don't have to." He held her gaze. "I'm asking because it's right. And because Janet would probably quit if I didn't, and I can't afford to lose Janet." That surprised a real sound out of Maria, a short, genuine breath of a laugh that she didn't quite manage to catch in time. She pressed her lips together quickly. "She would," Doris said contentedly from her chair. "That woman sounds terrifying." "She is," Richard said. A small silence settled over the room, but it was a different kind of silence from before. A little lighter. The way a room feels after a window has been opened. He stayed for 20 minutes. He did not stay long. He understood, without needing to be told, that he had already taken up more of their space than he was entitled to. He was a visitor here. An uninvited one at that. But in those 20 minutes, something happened that had not happened to Richard Anderson in a very long time. He listened. Doris talked. She was, it turned out, a natural talker in the best possible way, not someone who filled silence with noise but someone who filled it with things worth hearing. She talked about the neighborhood, about the family who had lived next door for 30 years, about the mango tree in the yard behind theirs that produced the best mangoes in the city but belonged to a man too old and too stubborn to pick them, so they simply fell and rotted on the ground every season. "Every year I watch those mangoes fall," she said with a deep philosophical sorrow. "Every year. A tragedy." "We could ask him," Maria said, in the voice of someone who had been through this conversation before. I have asked him. He says the tree belonged to his late wife and no one else's hands should touch it. Doris shook her head. I respect the sentiment. I do not respect the mangoes going to waste. Richard listened and said almost nothing and found, to his considerable surprise, that this was not a hardship. He had spent so much of his life in rooms where he was expected to speak, to lead, to define the direction of things, that he had almost forgotten what it felt like to simply sit and receive. To be a guest in someone else's story. He looked around the room while Doris talked. He looked at the framed photograph on the shelf, a younger Doris holding a small child on her lap, both of them squinting into the sun. He looked at the careful arrangement of pots on their nails above the small stove. He looked at the pale blue curtains, faded but ironed smooth. He looked at Maria, sitting across from him in the chair by the kitchen shelf, her hands folded in her lap, the tension in her shoulders very slowly, almost without her seeming to notice it, easing down. She had not fully relaxed. He understood that she wouldn't, not today. Trust, once knocked loose, didn't simply click back into place because someone showed up and apologized. He understood that. He had done it, the knocking loose, and the responsibility for what came next was his. When he stood to leave, he paused at the door. The medication, he said. He said it simply, without ceremony, because ceremony would have made it about him and it wasn't about him. Janet mentioned the cost. I'd like to take care of that. Whatever the treatment requires. Maria looked at him sharply. I'm not offering charity, he said before she could speak. I'm correcting a wrong. Those are different things. He met her eyes. If I hadn't fired you this morning, you would have your salary. You would have been able to manage. I took that from you with a 2-minute decision. This is me taking responsibility for that. A long pause. We'll talk about it, Maria said. It wasn't yes. But it wasn't no either. It was something that had a door in it. He nodded. Of course. He said goodbye to Doris, who reached out and patted his hand with her small dry one and said, Come back when you're less rumpled, dear, which he thought was probably the most unusual farewell he had ever received. He went out through the brown door. The cat was still there. He walked to his car, got in, and sat for a moment before starting the engine. The afternoon had moved on while he was inside. The light was lower now, going golden and long across the rooftops, and the children who had been kicking the plastic bottle earlier had gone in for the evening. The street was quieter. He started the engine. He drove back the way he had come, the dirt road, the patched concrete, the smooth tarmac, the wide clean streets, the trimmed trees, the world that was his world, and he drove differently from how he had driven out. Slower. More aware of the gap between where he had been and where he was going. That night, Richard sat at his 14-person dining table and ate alone as always. Janet had made grilled fish with roasted vegetables and a small dish of rice. She set it in front of him without a word, which meant she already knew he had gone, and she was waiting and she was not going to ask. He ate 3 bites. Then he put his fork down. Janet. She appeared in the doorway. Sir. Did you know she sold her phone? Pause. I didn't know that specifically. No. She sold her phone to buy medicine. He looked at the plate in front of him. And she still didn't eat at work. Janet said nothing. How long have you known? About the grandmother. About the situation. A few months, Janet said. She didn't tell me directly. I noticed things. The way she counted out her bus fare in the morning. The way she flinched whenever the subject of medical costs came up in conversation. She paused. And I found her crying in the linen cupboard once. She didn't know I'd seen her. I left her alone. She came out 5 minutes later and went straight back to work. Richard was quiet for a long time. Why didn't you tell me sooner? Janet considered this. Because, she said carefully, I wasn't sure you would have wanted to know. The words fell into the quiet room and stayed there. Richard picked up his fork again. Put it down again. He pushed the plate slightly to one side and rested his arms on the table. She's coming back, he said. Maria. I'm reinstating her. Better salary. He paused. And I want you to help me find the right hospital for the grandmother. The best oncology unit in the city. Whatever it costs. Janet was quiet for a moment. When she spoke, her voice was steady but only just. Yes, sir. And Janet. Sir. Thank you. For coming to my office this morning. He looked at the table. I don't know that I deserved it. But thank you. Another pause. A longer one. She deserved it, Janet said. Good night, Mr. Anderson. She went back to the kitchen. Richard sat alone at the long table for a long time that night, the chandelier burning above him with all 42 of its bulbs, the fountain running outside in the dark, the house perfectly quiet and perfectly clean all around him. He had never noticed before how loud silence could be when you were sitting in the middle of it by yourself. The next morning, Maria's phone rang at 7 o'clock. She didn't have her phone, she had sold it, so it was actually Doris' old phone, a small battered device that lived on the shelf and was used mostly for emergencies and for the church group chat that Doris monitored with great interest and occasional strong opinions. Maria answered it. Maria. Richard's voice. Careful. Professional. But with something underneath it that was neither of those things. I hope it's not too early. It's not, she said. She was already up. She was always already up. I'd like you to come in today if you're willing. We can discuss the new arrangement formally. Salary, terms, everything in writing this time. A short pause. I've also made some calls this morning about the oncology unit at Central Medical. They have a specialist who focuses specifically on lung cancer treatment. I've arranged a consultation for your grandmother on Friday if that works. All costs covered. Maria stood in the small kitchen in the early morning light, holding Doris' old phone, and said nothing for a moment. Maria? I'm here, she said. I know this doesn't undo this morning. Yesterday morning. Pause. I know an apology and a phone call doesn't balance the account. I'm not trying to say it does. She looked out through the pale blue curtain at the morning coming in over the rooftops. The sky was pink and gold and very clear. I'll come in, she said. I'll be there at the usual time. She could hear something shift slightly on the other end of the line. Not quite a sigh. Something smaller. Something relieved. Thank you, he said. She hung up. She stood in the kitchen for a moment, her hand resting on the shelf where the phone lived. Then she turned around and looked at her grandmother, who was sitting at the small table eating the thin porridge Maria had made, watching her over the rim of the bowl with bright, knowing eyes. Well? Doris said. I'm going back to work. Doris nodded slowly as if this was merely the confirmation of something she had already decided. And the other thing he said? I heard you not saying anything for quite a long time in the middle. Maria looked at her. He's arranged a consultation. At Central Medical. For your lungs. She kept her voice steady. Friday. Doris set her bowl down. She looked at the table for a moment. Then she looked up at Maria, and her sharp brown eyes were very bright, and she said nothing for a while. Just looked at her granddaughter with a look that held 21 years of everything in it, every early morning and every difficult evening and every prayer said quietly and every worry carried silently and every moment of holding on when holding on was the hardest thing. Good, she said finally. Her voice was steady. Mostly. Maria picked up her apron from the hook by the door. She went to work. The first week was careful. That was the only word for it. Everything between Richard and Maria in those first days back was careful. Like two people walking across the same bridge, both aware that it had cracked once and neither quite sure yet how much weight it could hold. Maria arrived at 6:15 as always. She cleaned the rooms, managed the laundry, organized the linen. She moved through the house with the same quiet precision she had always had, the same invisible efficiency. On the surface nothing had changed. But things had changed. She noticed it in small ways at first. The staff entrance, which had always had a slightly broken coat hook that sent your jacket sliding to the floor if you didn't balance it just right, it was fixed now. Properly fixed, with a new hook and a small wooden backing plate, done neatly and without any announcement. The break room, which the household staff used for their lunch, a plain little room near the laundry with a small table and 2 plastic chairs, had a new coffee machine in it. A simple one, not expensive but clean and new and actually working, unlike the old one that had been producing a sound like a small unhappy engine for the better part of a year. And her salary, which appeared in her account at the end of the first week, was $70 more than it had ever been. No conversation about it. No ceremony. It was simply there. She did not thank him directly for any of these things. She wasn't sure how. The language of this new situation hadn't quite formed itself yet. What was appropriate, what was too much, what would sound like too little. So she said nothing and he said nothing, and the fixed coat hook and the new coffee machine and the extra $70 sat between them as a kind of quiet conversation that neither of them needed to put into words. Janet watched all of this with the expression of someone trying very hard not to look pleased with themselves. It was the second week when the first real conversation happened. Not the formal one. They had already had the formal one on Maria's first day back. That one had taken place in Richard's office, with a printed contract on the desk and everything stated clearly. Salary, hours, terms, the medical arrangement for Doris laid out precisely, a separate account set up for the hospital costs. Richard had been professional and thorough, and Maria had read every line before signing, which he had watched her do without rushing her, and she had noticed that he didn't rush her, and had made a small note of it somewhere inside. No, the second week conversation was different. It happened by accident, the way the real ones usually do. Maria was cleaning the second-floor hallway when she passed the open door of the library, a room she cleaned but that Richard rarely seemed to use for anything other than storage. Except that evening he was in it, sitting in the large chair near the window with a book open on his lap, though he wasn't reading it. He was looking out the window at the garden below, his hand resting on the open page somewhere else entirely. She would have passed by. She was good at passing by. But he looked up. Maria. She stopped. Stood in the doorway. Sir. I didn't know you were in here. I can come back. No, it's fine. He looked at the book in his lap as if noticing it for the first time. He closed it. How is she? Your grandmother. The first consultation was Friday. Maria had not expected him to remember the day. She hesitated for just a second. It went well. The specialist, Dr. Abrams, he was very thorough. He's adjusting her treatment plan. She paused. She liked him. She told him his shirt was a very sensible color. Something happened at the corner of Richard's mouth. A brief, unguarded thing. That sounds like something she would say. She says it every time she approves of someone. It's her highest compliment. He looked at her. What color is my shirt usually when she's seen me? Gray, Maria said. Or dark blue. He glanced down at his current shirt, which was in fact dark gray. And those are sensible colors? Apparently. A small pause. She called the specialist's shirt sensible because it was green. I think the bar may be personal. This time the thing at the corner of his mouth went all the way. A real smile, brief and slightly rusty, like something that hadn't been used enough but genuine. It changed his face considerably. Made it look less like a decision and more like a person. Maria noticed this. She looked away. Good, he said. I'm glad he was thorough. She nodded. She continued down the hallway with her cloth and her spray bottle, and the conversation was over. But it sat with her for the rest of the day in a way that was not uncomfortable. By the third week, the conversations were less accidental. Not planned, nothing so deliberate as that. But they were no longer purely accidental either. They happened in the spaces between things. In the kitchen in the late afternoon when the house was quietening down. In the hallway outside his office when they happened to finish something at the same time. Once, briefly in the garden, she was picking up some dead leaves that had blown against the fountain, and he came outside with his phone and sat on the stone bench nearby to take a call, and when the call ended he didn't go back inside immediately, and they had talked about the bougainvillea for 4 minutes. For minutes about flowers. She wouldn't have thought he knew anything about flowers. He knew more than she expected. She started to understand something about Richard Anderson in those weeks that she suspected very few people ever got close enough to understand. He was not, at his core, a cold person. He was a careful one. There was a difference. Cold people don't feel the temperature. Careful people feel it constantly. That was why they moved so slowly, so precisely, keeping everything measured and controlled and at the right distance. Because somewhere they had learned that things got broken when you weren't careful. She didn't know yet what had taught him that. But she recognized the lesson. She had learned a version of it herself. Doris, for her part, had opinions. She was on her second consultation with Dr. Abrams now, and the new treatment plan was already showing small results. Her appetite had improved slightly, and there were mornings when the cough was lighter than it had been. She was sitting up more. Reading again. Watching the street from the window with her customary sharp interest in everyone else's business. And she was asking questions. What's he like? She asked one evening as Maria was preparing dinner. Who? Who me? Mr. Anderson. Maria stirred the pot. He's my employer, Grandma. That's a description, not an answer. Maria stirred more deliberately. He's private, formal. He knows things about gardens that surprised me. He works very hard. She paused. He remembered that your appointment was on Friday. Doris was quiet for a moment. Did he? It doesn't mean anything. He's an organized person. Said Doris. Which was not agreement but wasn't disagreement either. It was simply Doris storing information. Maria pointed the wooden spoon in her direction. Don't what? I'm sitting here perfectly quietly. You're thinking loudly. Doris arranged her face into an expression of complete innocence. I don't know what you mean. She reached for her cup of tea. I'll say only one thing. Grandma. One thing. She held up a single finger. A man who fixes a broken coat hook and buys a coffee machine for people he doesn't need to impress is a man paying attention. She sipped her tea. That's all. I'm done. Maria turned back to the pot and said nothing. But she was thinking about the coat hook. The fourth week brought a morning that Maria would think about for a long time afterward. She arrived at the mansion at her usual time, signed in, changed her shoes. She was halfway through the dining room when Janet appeared at the door and said quietly, "Come to the kitchen for a moment." Maria followed her. Janet closed the kitchen door behind them, which she almost never did, and turned around with the expression of someone assembling difficult words into the right order. "Dr. Abrams called the house this morning," she said. "He called here because the number Mr. Anderson gave as the primary contact was this house. He wanted to speak to you." She paused. "He's asked that you come in with your grandmother on Thursday. He wants to go over the latest scan results in person." Maria looked at her. "He didn't say anything else?" she asked. Her voice was steady. She was already doing the thing, the pulling together, the controlled breathing, the careful face. "No," Janet said. "He just said in person." "In person. Doctors asked you to come in person when the news was not the kind that should travel over a phone line." Maria knew this. She had learned it 6 months ago in a plastic chair in a small office that smelled of antiseptic. She nodded. "Okay. Maria. I'm fine." She picked up her cleaning cloth from the counter where she'd set it down. "I'll call him back on my break and confirm the time." Janet looked at her for a moment with something in her face that was not pity. Maria didn't want pity, but was something close to the look Doris got sometimes. The look of someone who wanted to take a weight from you and couldn't find a way to lift it. "Sit down for a minute," Janet said. "I have the rooms will wait 5 minutes." Her voice was gentle but firm. She pulled out a chair from the kitchen table and waited. Maria sat down. Janet poured 2 cups of coffee without asking and sat across from her and pushed 1 cup across the table. They sat together in the warm kitchen, not talking much, just sitting. The coffee was strong and good. Outside, the gardener had arrived and was doing something with the hedge trimmer that produced a regular, distant buzz. After a few minutes, Maria wrapped both hands around her cup and said, "I'm scared." Just that. 2 words. But the way she said them, quietly, without drama, like putting down something very heavy, made them fill the whole room. "I know," Janet said. They finished their coffee. Then Maria stood up, straightened her apron, and went back to the dining room. She did not tell Richard about Thursday. She wasn't sure it was her place to tell him. The medical arrangement was his generosity, yes, but the situation was hers. She didn't want to bring her fear into his house any more than she already had. She preferred to carry it the way she had always carried things, quietly inside where it couldn't slow her down. But that evening, as she was preparing to leave, she passed the hallway outside his office and the door was open and he was sitting at his desk. He looked up when he heard her footsteps. "Good night," she said. It was what she always said. He looked at her for a moment, that careful, precise look she had come to recognize, and said, "Are you all right?" She stopped. It was such a simple question. 4 words. People said it 100 times a day without meaning it, as a greeting, as a filler, as a way of acknowledging someone without actually stopping. But Richard Anderson was not a man who said things he didn't mean. She understood that about him now. She stood in the hallway for a moment with her bag on her shoulder and the evening behind her and her grandmother's face in her mind and the thought of Thursday sitting somewhere at the base of her throat like something she hadn't been able to swallow all day. "I'm not sure yet," she said. He looked at her steadily. "Is there anything I can do?" She thought about it honestly, which was different from the automatic "no, I'm fine, don't worry" that lived right at the front of her mouth for exactly these moments. "Not tonight," she said. "But thank you." He nodded. "Good night, Maria." "Good night, sir." She walked down the hallway and out through the back door and into the evening. The air outside was cooler now, beginning its slow move toward the dry season. She walked to the bus stop with her bag on her shoulder and the question still sitting in her chest, not heavier somehow than it had been before she stopped. Just accompanied. The way fear feels slightly different when someone has looked at it with you, even briefly, even from a distance. She got on the bus. She went home to her grandmother. And she began quietly to prepare herself for Thursday. The waiting room at Central Medical's oncology unit was painted a pale green that was probably meant to be calming. It wasn't. Maria sat beside her grandmother in 2 of the blue plastic chairs along the wall, their shoulders almost touching, both of them looking at the same middle distance that people look at in waiting rooms when they are trying not to think about why they are there. Doris had worn her good blouse, cream-colored with small buttons down the front, and had plaited her hair neatly. She always dressed carefully for doctors. She said it was a matter of respect for them and for yourself. They had taken the bus together that morning. Doris moved more slowly now than she had even a month ago, and the walk from the bus stop had taken longer than Maria had planned for, so they arrived 4 minutes late, which bothered Maria considerably and bothered Doris not at all. "We're here," Doris had said serenely. "That's the important part." Now they waited. Maria's hands were folded in her lap. She was doing the breathing, slow, measured, the kind that doesn't show on the outside. She had been doing it since Tuesday. She had been doing it in her sleep, probably. Doris reached over and placed her small dry hand over Maria's folded ones. She didn't say anything. Just placed her hand there, warm and steady, the way she had been placing her hand on Maria's worry since Maria was 3 years old. And Maria turned her hands over and held on. Dr. Abrams was a tall man with careful eyes and the green shirt that Doris had approved of at the first appointment. He shook their hands, gestured to the chairs across from his desk, and sat down with the measured quietness of a man who had learned, over many years, that how you began a conversation like this one mattered enormously. He opened the folder in front of him. "I want to start by saying that the new treatment plan has had some positive effects," he said. "Your appetite improvement is real, Mrs. Doris, and your body has responded better than I expected to the medication adjustment." He paused. He looked at the folder. Then he looked up. "But the scan results from last week show that the primary tumor in your right lung has grown. And there is now a secondary site that wasn't visible in the first scan." The room was very quiet. "What does that mean?" Maria asked. Her voice came out perfectly level. She was proud of that in a distant way, even as she felt the floor shift slightly under her. Dr. Abrams looked at her directly. "It means that we are no longer looking at a treatment path aimed at remission. The cancer has advanced beyond the point where we can reasonably expect to stop it." He paused to let that settle. "What we can do and what I want to focus on now is palliative care. Managing pain, maintaining quality of life, keeping her comfortable and as strong as possible for as long as possible." Maria nodded. She nodded the way she had nodded in a plastic chair 6 months ago in a small office that smelled of antiseptic. She nodded the way she had learned to nod when the information arriving was too large to be responded to immediately, so you received it carefully and let your body do something manageable, nodding, while the rest of you caught up. Doris was looking at Dr. Abrams with her sharp brown eyes, very calm, very present. "How long?" she asked. Dr. Abrams held her gaze. "It's difficult to give a precise." "Roughly," Doris said. "I'm 71 years old and I have lived an honest life. I can manage a rough answer." Pause. "Months," he said. "Several months with good care. Possibly longer, depending on how you respond." Doris nodded slowly. She looked down at her hands in her lap for a moment. Then she looked up at Maria. Maria was looking straight ahead at the wall above Dr. Abrams' head. Her jaw was very tight. Her eyes were bright, the dangerous bright, the kind that means something is being held back by force. Doris reached over and did the same thing she had done in the waiting room. She placed her hand over Maria's. This time Maria's hands were not folded. They were gripping each other, knuckle-white, like two people holding onto the same rope. "My granddaughter," Doris said to Dr. Abrams pleasantly, "is going to need a moment." "Of course," he said. "Take all the time you need." They sat outside on a bench in the hospital garden afterward. The garden was small but real, actual grass, a few trees, a low bed of flowering shrubs along the wall. Someone had put thought into it. Probably because people who came to this part of the hospital needed somewhere to go when the inside of buildings became too much. They sat side by side in the afternoon sun. Doris had her eyes closed and her face tilted slightly upward, feeling the warmth of it. Maria was looking at the shrubs without seeing them. They had been sitting for about 10 minutes when Doris said, "Stop punishing yourself for crying." "I'm not crying," Maria said. "You're not crying right now. You were in the bathroom for 7 minutes." Maria said nothing. "I counted," Doris said. 7 minutes is a long time to wash your hands." A short silence. "I'm all right," Maria said. "Maria." Her grandmother opened her eyes and looked at her. "I know you are. You are the most all right person I have ever known, and it is one of your greatest qualities and also one of the things that worries me most about you." She turned on the bench to look at her granddaughter fully. "I need you to hear what I'm going to say." Maria turned to look at her. "I am not afraid," Doris said. "I want you to understand that. I have had a full life. Not an easy life but a full one. And the best of it, the very best, has been you. You, from the time you were 3 years old and you used to sit on the kitchen floor and talk to the pots." A small light moved through her eyes. You were always talking to things. Pots, lizards, plants. You'd have a full conversation with a mango seed. Despite everything, Maria made a sound that was almost a laugh. I am not afraid, Doris said again. And I don't want you to spend whatever time we have left being afraid on my behalf. I want you here. Fully here. She reached up and put her hand against Maria's cheek. Can you do that for me? Maria covered her grandmother's hand with her own. She pressed her eyes shut for a moment. I'll try, she said. It came out rough, but it came out. Good, Doris said. She patted her cheek once and settled back on the bench and closed her eyes again in the sun. Now, tell me what that young man is going to say when you tell him. Maria blinked. What young man? Doris smiled without opening her eyes. Don't. Richard was still in his office when Maria arrived at the mansion the following morning. She knocked on the open door. He looked up from his laptop. She had decided on the bus that she would tell him simply and briefly, the facts, nothing more. He had arranged the medical care, he deserved to be informed of the medical situation. It was a practical conversation. She had organized it in her head. Dr. Abrams had the scan results, she said. The cancer has advanced. They're moving to palliative care. Richard looked at her. He didn't say I'm sorry immediately, which was the thing most people said first, reflexively, because they needed to say something and that was the available thing. He just looked at her for a moment, fully the way she had noticed he looked at things he was taking seriously. Sit down, he said. He said it the way Doris said it, not as a command but as an offering. She sat. How are you? He asked. I'm managing. That's not what I asked. She looked at him. He held her gaze, steady and patient, and waited. I'm frightened, she said. And I'm sad. And I'm also trying to be present for her because that's what she asked me to do. She paused. I'm all of those things at the same time and I'm not sure there's a tidy answer to how I am. There doesn't have to be, he said. They sat in a brief silence that was not uncomfortable. She's not afraid, Maria said. She told me that. She stopped. Started again. She's so much braver than I am. I think, Richard said carefully, that she learned it from someone. Maria looked at him. He was looking at the desk, not at her, which somehow made it easier to receive. She didn't respond to it. She wasn't ready to respond to it. But she held it somewhere quiet and later on the bus home she took it out and looked at it and found that it helped. The months that followed were the strangest and most important of Maria's life. Strange because they contained grief and growth at the same time, which she had not understood was possible until she lived it. She had thought, without knowing she thought it, that grief was something that stopped everything else, a season of pure darkness where nothing grew. But that was not how it was. The garden of her life kept growing even as one of its oldest trees was slowly, quietly letting go. Doris had good days and harder days. On the good days she sat by the window and read and held court over the neighborhood with her sharp eyes, and in the evenings Maria would come home and find her full of information about things she had observed. The family 3 doors down was having some kind of disagreement, she could tell by the frequency of the door slamming. The man with the mango tree had finally allowed a child to pick 3 of them, which Doris considered a significant spiritual development. On the harder days she stayed in bed and the cough was worse and the pain was there despite the medication, and Maria would sit on the edge of her bed and read to her, news, stories, sometimes just whatever book was nearest, and Doris would lie with her eyes closed and listen, and sometimes she would be asleep before Maria finished the page and sometimes she was simply resting, and Maria learned to tell the difference. Richard came to visit on a Saturday afternoon 3 weeks after the Thursday appointment. He brought nothing extravagant, just a container of soup that Janet had made, and a small bundle of those bougainvillea flowers from the mansion garden, cut carefully and wrapped in paper. He stood at the brown door with these things and looked, Maria thought, rather less certain of himself than he usually did. Doris received him like a queen receiving a slightly nervous courtier, and somehow managed to make him sit in the good chair and eat a biscuit within 5 minutes of arrival. Maria watched them from the kitchen shelf while she made tea. She watched Richard listen to Doris the same way he had listened on his first visit. Genuinely, without impatience, without checking his phone. She watched Doris take his measure with those sharp eyes and slowly, over the course of the afternoon, begin to speak to him the way she spoke to people she had decided were worth speaking to properly. He came back the following Saturday. And the one after that. He never announced these visits in advance. He would simply appear at the brown door on Saturday afternoons with something Janet had made and whatever flowers were going in the garden, and Doris would open the door and say, "Ah," in a tone that suggested she had been expecting him, and let him in. Maria found, somewhere in the 3rd or 4th Saturday, that she had stopped being surprised by his presence and started expecting it. That the week had a shape now that included Saturday afternoon. That the sound of his car on the dirt road had become something she recognized, somewhere below conscious thought, the way you recognize a particular bird song without stopping to identify it. She did not examine this too closely. There was too much else to hold. It was on one of those Saturday afternoons that the subject of nursing came up. Doris had brought it up. Of course she had. She had a talent for introducing topics into a room so naturally that you couldn't quite tell when the conversation had turned. Maria wanted to be a nurse, she mentioned, in the pleasant tone of someone making light conversation. Richard looked at Maria. Maria looked at her grandmother with the expression of someone who knows exactly what is happening but can't prove it. I was going to apply for the program, Maria said, keeping her voice even. Before, there were other priorities. The application is still possible, Doris said. The entrance preparation course runs at the community college. I asked one of the women from church about it. Grandma. I was curious. You were meddling. I was curious through the method of asking questions, Doris said firmly. That's called being informed. Richard was looking at Maria with a thoughtful expression. You never mentioned it. It's not, she stopped. It was something I set aside. For practical reasons. It could be unset aside, he said. For practical reasons. He paused. The preparation course, how long is it? 6 months, Maria said before she could stop herself. He nodded slowly. Before work? After? Richard. I'm asking practically. She looked at him. He looked back with that steady, patient expression that she had come to understand meant he was not going to be dissuaded by her pretending something didn't matter to her. Early mornings, she said after a moment. The first session is at 6. And work starts at 7:15. He nodded again. That works. I can't afford. Maria. His voice was quiet. I have found over the past few months that arguing with you is one of the most instructive exercises of my entire professional life. The corner of his mouth moved. I'm not offering to pay for it. I'm pointing out that the time works. You can pay for it yourself with the salary you are now earning, which is what was always supposed to happen before things got difficult. He paused. That's all I'm saying. She looked at him for a long moment. Doris was looking out the window with the elaborate attention of someone who is absolutely not listening. I'll look into it, Maria said. Which, for Maria, was as close to yes as yes. She enrolled in the preparation course 6 days later. She went every morning at 6 o'clock, 5 days a week, to a classroom in the community college 3 bus stops from home. The classroom was small and often cold in the early morning and full of other people who wanted to be nurses. Young people and older people and people who had been something else first and were trying again. Maria sat in the 3rd row and opened her notebook and wrote everything down. She came alive in that room. She hadn't expected it, or she had forgotten, somewhere in the years of managing and surviving, that there were things that made her feel like this. Like the top of her head had been lifted off and something clean and wide was blowing through. She asked questions which she almost never did anywhere else. She read ahead in the textbooks. She found herself thinking about things she had learned at the bus stop, at the market, while washing dishes, connecting and applying and wondering in ways that felt like running after years of walking. She told Doris about it every evening at dinner. Doris listened with her whole face. The first really cold night came in what the doctors had indicated would be the difficult stretch. Maria had stayed home from work that day. Richard had insisted, and she had not argued for once, because Doris had woken in considerable pain and had not been able to eat. Dr. Abrams had adjusted the medication and by afternoon she was more comfortable, resting in her bed with the pale blue curtains open because she said she wanted to see the light. Maria sat beside the bed and read to her. She was reading from a book Doris had always loved, an old story about a woman who walks across a country to find her daughter. When Doris said quietly, Maria, stop reading a moment. Maria stopped. She put her finger in the page. She looked at her grandmother. Doris was looking at the ceiling with an expression that was far away and very peaceful, the way people look when they have arrived after a long journey, somewhere they recognize. I need to say some things, she said, while I'm feeling clear. Maria's throat tightened. Grandma. Listen. She listened. I am proud of you, Doris said. Not for surviving, though you have survived things that would have broken many people. Not for working hard, though you have worked harder than anyone should have to. She paused. Her voice was slow and deliberate, choosing each word with care. I am proud of you for remaining kind. And all of it. For not letting any of it make you hard. She turned her head to look at Maria. That is the rarest thing. And it is entirely yours. I take no credit for it. It came from inside you. Maria's eyes were full. Richard Anderson, Doris said. Maria blinked. Grandma, this is not the time. It is exactly the time. I'm using my old woman prerogative. She settled her head back against the pillow. He is a good man who had forgotten how to be one. You reminded him. Not deliberately, you never do anything for effect, but simply by being yourself in his house, in his world. A small breath. Don't close yourself to that. Don't decide it's too complicated or too different or too much of one thing and not enough of another. She looked at the ceiling. Love is practical, Maria. It shows up on Saturday afternoons. It fixes broken coat hooks. It asks if you are all right and means it. She paused. Don't make it more complicated than it is. A long, full silence. I'll try, Maria whispered. Good. Doris closed her eyes. Read me a little more of the book. Maria found the page. She read, her voice steady and slow, while the afternoon light moved across the room and her grandmother rested, and the pale blue curtains moved gently in a small wind from the open window. The call came on a Tuesday morning. Maria was in her nursing preparation class, second row. She had moved up a row, with her notebook open and a diagram of the respiratory system half drawn in front of her, when her phone buzzed on the desk. The number on the screen was the neighbor's, Mrs. Pauline, who had a key and checked in most mornings. She was out of the classroom and into the corridor in 4 steps. Come home, Mrs. Pauline said. Come now, love. She does not remember the bus ride. She remembers arriving at the house. She remembers the brown door. She remembers Mrs. Pauline's face, kind and grave, and the way she stepped aside without a word. Doris was in her bed in the pale morning light, very still. She was not gone yet. But she was going. Her breathing had changed, slow and widely spaced like the last pages of a book. Her face was relaxed, the deep lines in it softened, and she looked, Maria would think about this for years, she looked like someone who has put down every heavy thing they were carrying and simply rested. Maria sat on the edge of the bed and took her grandmother's hand in both of hers. She did not cry. Not yet. That would come later in great waves for many days. For now she simply held on and talked, quietly, the way you talk to someone who is between here and somewhere else. She told her about the class that morning, the respiratory diagram, the fact that she had moved to the second row. She told her about the mango tree, whether or not the old man had let anyone else pick from it lately. She told her that the cat from the end of the road had had kittens and they were in a box by Mrs. Pauline's gate. Small things. True things. The thread of ordinary life, spoken out loud, so that her grandmother could hear it as she went. She was still holding her hand, still talking when Richard arrived. She did not know how he knew. She found out later that Mrs. Pauline had called the mansion. She had the number from the medical arrangements, and she had called because she thought Maria should not be alone. He had driven without stopping and arrived in 40 minutes. He came in quietly. He looked at the room, at Doris, at Maria. He said nothing. He sat down in the chair against the wall, the chair that was always there, that Maria used sometimes when she read to her grandmother in the evenings, and he stayed. He did not try to comfort her with words. He did not try to manage the situation or direct it. He simply stayed. Present and still, in the chair against the wall, a human anchor at the edge of the room. An hour later, as the morning light shifted and the pale blue curtains lifted once in a small breath of wind, Doris grew still. And Maria made a sound, small and completely broken, and then she was crying in the way she had not allowed herself to cry in a very long time, in the deep uncontrolled way that has no performance in it and no holding back, the way grief comes when it has been patient long enough. Richard crossed the room. He sat beside her on the edge of the bed and put his arms around her, and she turned into him and wept. He held her without saying anything, without telling her it would be all right, without any of the words that would have been less than the moment. He simply held her, solid and warm in there. And she let him. She let herself be held. Which was the hardest and most important thing she had ever done. The weeks after the funeral were quiet in the way that weeks are quiet when something enormous has gone out of the world and left a space shaped exactly like it. Maria went back to work. She went back to the preparation course. She made herself move through the days because movement was what she knew, and because Doris had asked her to be present, and presence meant continuing. But the house on the dirt road was different now, still clean, still carefully maintained, but hushed in a way that pressed against her when she came home in the evenings. She kept the herb bundle hanging by the window. She kept the photograph on the shelf, Doris in the sun, squinting with the small child on her lap. She kept the pale blue curtains. Richard drove her home every evening for the first month. He didn't announce this as a plan or ask her permission. He simply appeared at the staff entrance at the end of the working day and said, "I'll drive you," and she had looked at him the first time and started to say it wasn't necessary, and he had simply waited and she had not finished the sentence. They drove mostly in a comfortable quiet. Sometimes they talked, about her course, about his work, about small things that had happened during the day. About Doris sometimes. He asked about her, not in a careful, tiptoeing way but directly, genuinely, because he had come to know her and he wanted to remember her properly. He told Maria one evening in the car about his own father. How he had died when Richard was 31, and how he had sat dry-eyed at the funeral because that was what his family did, and how he had regretted it ever since, not the dry eyes exactly but the distance. The years of practice distance that had meant he and his father had never really spoken about the things that mattered. "I thought control was strength," he said. "For a very long time. I built everything on that idea." Maria looked at him in the blue evening light. "What changed it?" she said. He was quiet for a moment. "A loaf of bread," he said. She looked at the road ahead. "And the person who took it," he said. The letter arrived on a cold, bright morning 3 months after the funeral. Maria was at the kitchen shelf, preparing breakfast, when she saw it. A white envelope on the table, her name on the front, and the college crest in the corner. She had sat the entrance examination for the nursing program 4 weeks earlier. She had told almost no one. She had been almost superstitious about it, as if speaking it too clearly might somehow make it fragile. She picked up the envelope. She put it down. She picked it up again. She opened it. She read the first 3 lines. Then she sat down on the floor, not in a chair, on the floor, because her legs simply decided that was where she was going. She sat on the clean swept floor of her small kitchen with the letter in her hands and read it again. And again. "Dear Maria, we are pleased to offer you a place in the Bachelor of Nursing program, beginning in the first semester." She pressed the letter against her chest. She sat on the floor for a long time. Then she stood up. She straightened her apron. She picked up her bag. She had never in 3 years been late to work. She was not going to start today. She told Richard that evening. She had not planned to tell him at work. It was personal, it was hers, she would tell him when the time was right. But the day had gone on and the news had been sitting in her chest like a warm light that kept getting warmer, and by the time the evening came she had run out of reasons to wait. She knocked on the open office door. He looked up. "I was accepted," she said. "The nursing program." He looked at her for one moment. Then he stood up. "Maria," he said. And the way he said her name, with all of his usual control gently laid aside, just for a second, just long enough, said everything that words might have taken much longer to find. "I start in September," she said. Her voice was completely steady. Her eyes were not. He crossed the room and stood before her, and he looked at her the way she had watched him look at things he cared about deeply, fully and without pretense. "Doris would be," he started. "I know," she said. "I know she would." They stood in the doorway of his office for a moment, close enough that she could see the small gold thread in the fabric of his jacket, close enough to feel the warmth of him. "I have something I need to say," he said. "And I want to say it now before I manage to talk myself out of it." She waited. "These months," he stopped. Started again. "I have been a different person in these months than I have been for most of my adult life. Better one, I think. More honest. More present." He paused. "I know where that came from. I know exactly where it came from." She looked at him steadily. "I'm not asking you for anything because of gratitude," he said. "I want to be clear about that. This is not gratitude. Gratitude is what I felt in October. What I feel now is—" He looked at her with the particular expression of a man who has built his life on precision and is currently face to face with something that refuses to be precise. "I feel that my life is better and fuller and truer when you are in it. Not in my house. In my life." He paused. "I would like, if you're willing, to build something with you. Not because of what happened, but because of who you are." The office was very quiet. The fountain ran outside in the dark. Maria looked at him for a long moment. She thought about her grandmother on the bench outside the hospital, saying love is practical. It shows up on Saturday afternoons. She thought about the coat hook. About the coffee machine. About the man sitting in the chair against the wall of her grandmother's room, steady and present, because he chose to be. "I'm not saying yes because I'm grateful," she said. "I want you to know that." "I know," he said. "I'm saying yes because of who you are," she said. "Who you became." He looked at her. Something moved across his face that was not quite a smile. It was deeper than a smile, quieter, the expression of someone who has been found after a long time of being slightly lost. "Yes," he said. "Yes," she said. They married in the spring in the small church Doris had attended for 40 years. It was not a large wedding. Neither of them wanted large. There were flowers, bougainvillea, purple and extravagant, brought from the mansion garden, and there was good food that Janet had made with the particular ferocity she brought to things she cared about, and there were the people who mattered, which turned out to be not very many but entirely the right ones. Maria wore a dress that was simple and cream-colored, and she carried a small bunch of the herbs that had always hung by Doris' window, dried now and tied with a ribbon. She walked to the front of the church alone. She had considered this carefully. She had no father, no uncle, no one whose traditional role it was to give her away. And she had decided, after thinking about it for one evening, that she did not need to be given. She had always arrived under her own power. She would arrive here the same way. She walked down the aisle by herself, slowly, with her chin up and her eyes forward. And when she reached the front and stood beside Richard and looked at his face, at the expression on it, which was not the composed, controlled expression she had first known but something wide open and unguarded and wholly, entirely real, she knew she had made the right decision. In this and in everything. Janet cried from the third row with the absolute conviction of someone who considers this entirely justified. The clinic opened 14 months later. It was not a grand building, not at first. It was a converted space on the edge of the city, in the neighborhood where Maria had grown up, 2 bus rides from the dirt road where she had lived. But it was clean and bright and well-equipped, with real doctors and real medicine and a waiting room painted a color that was actually calming. It was called the Doris Conceição Free Oncology Clinic. The name was Maria's idea. Richard had agreed immediately before she had even finished suggesting it. They stood outside on the morning of the opening, the two of them in the early light before the first patients arrived. Maria looked up at the name on the wall. Doris Conceição Free Oncology Clinic. She thought about her grandmother at 5 in the morning, already in the kitchen when Maria woke up. About her voice singing while she worked. About her hands always warm, always reaching. About 2 thin braids and a pale pink nightgown and sharp brown eyes that saw everything. About the way she had said I am not afraid and meant it completely down to her bones. About a mango tree whose fruit fell every year, uncollected, and a woman who watched it with philosophical sorrow. Richard stood beside her. He found her hand and held it. She would say the color of the sign is sensible, he said. Maria looked at the sign. It was dark green letters on a white background. She would, Maria agreed. She stood there a little longer, her hand in his, the morning light growing slowly around them, the city beginning its daily noise behind her, the clinic waiting to receive its first patients. And somewhere in the quiet of that moment, she understood something that she had been learning for a long time, through every difficult morning and every counted pill bottle and every careful breath on every hard day. Her grandmother had not simply given her survival. She had given her the belief that survival was worth building on. That the things you carried could become the things you created. That love, the real kind, the practical kind, left something in the world when it went. Something that lasted. Something that helped. She knew her grandmother's spirit lived on. It lived in every life they would save. In every waiting room where someone scared and tired sat in a plastic chair and heard the doctor call their name. In every medication that arrived without a bill attached. In every person who walked out through the clinic doors a little less alone than when they walked in. It lived in Maria's hands. And her hands were already reaching. I hope you enjoyed watching it as much as I enjoyed creating it. Like, share and comment on the lessons you've learned. Let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. See you in my next video.